Recently, and not so recently, Leigh and I have talked about simple, minimal cameras. We've used the term mindful cameras, and we've also used the term therapy cameras. Now, neither is any sort of official camera classification, and for the most part, almost any camera can be anything that you want it to be on any given day. There are a couple of class-leading cameras in this made-up category, notably the Fujifilm X100 series and the Leica Q series. And Ricoh has a couple, and there's a few others out there as well from different manufacturers. Now, before we go much further, I do want to turn it over to Leigh for just a moment. Like no one else I've come across, she explains the concept in a way that makes sense to many while communicating what cameras like this mean to her specifically.
Thank you, Raymond. Depending on the day of the week, I'll call it a mindful camera or a therapy camera. But really what I'm talking about is the basics. Stripping away some of the stress and having fun, keeping the pressure low, and most of all, being in the moment rather than thinking about how I'm going to use the images for my work here on the internet or how the photo would look printed and hanging on the wall. Sometimes I'm just experimenting, but the photos are just for me. Often, for me, this means a small and lean camera body, maybe one that is years old, and a simple, fast aperture prime lens. And focal lengths may vary depending on my mood or, you know what, my often arbitrary choice. Even if it seems like a bad focal length for wherever it is that I'm going. But like I said before, sometimes I'm experimenting. These photos aren't necessarily about the result. I'm looking for the artistic experience. And it is that experimentation with my art. And it's those times when I end up discovering something new by limiting my technical choices with gear and by releasing my expectations of others. We're fortunate to have made the potentially unwise and definitely expensive decision to own both the Fujifilm X100V and the Leica Q2. Both of these to me qualify as mindful cameras. However, they are often purchased as a camera in addition to an interchangeable lens camera, and in practical terms, that is definitely not going to be a choice that every camera owner makes. The attention turns to what can you do with the camera that you have, instead of going out with the intention to have every focal length covered. What if you went out with your camera and had virtually no focal lengths covered, except for one? I love going out with any of my camera bodies and one prime lens. It mixes things up and it's just so enjoyable. And while I will never tell you how to set your camera, I will say that when I set up a therapy camera for the day, I may be setting it to JPEG only and not necessarily at the camera's highest resolution. Like I said earlier, this is about limiting my technical choices and staying in the moment while I'm photographing. And if I'm feeling creative, I may dial in custom settings for color, contrast, grain, and more that bring out the feelings in me and maybe the subject rather than technical accuracy. I may mute the colors, add grain, or even shift everything toward a cross-processed look. It's a callback to film photography, incorporating some of the technical aspects that digital photography can help us enjoy. And sometimes I like to go out with actual film. When I shoot this way, I know I'm going to miss some shots that I would normally love to have. I also know I'm going to come home with shots that I would not have otherwise visualized nor captured. Some people might call this slowing down or even zooming with your feet, but really for me, it's about the technical aspects of the camera fading away and letting my mind do the walking and the shooting without paying much attention to the camera at all. I've said it, and while I will use it, my goal is to also forget it and allow my mind and body to engage with it or not, to just let the art and the experimentation happen one way or another. I like to keep a camera like this in my bag. On any given day, it might not leave my bag, or it might be the focus of my activities, or somewhere in the middle is the most likely. One thing that I do know is that I want it there with me. This is my lifestyle, in case you couldn't tell, and something that I enjoy, and I'd feel incomplete without its presence.
Now, this isn't the first time that I've heard that explanation from her. I'm privy to the 24/7 rolling commentary from her, and she has the misfortune of hearing mine, and our younger child talks about as much as I do, so it's easy to understand why she actually does feel the need for a therapy camera. I do not blame her one bit. And as Leigh said, not everyone is going to purchase an additional camera to be their therapy camera. And we both want to emphasize this. Your therapy camera can be your phone. It can be a digicam from 20 years ago. It could be a film camera from 40 years ago. Or it can even be the big badass mirrorless rig and system that you've purchased over the course of the past couple of years. There's no rules for this, and I hope that there never are. For this video, we wanted to take a couple of interchangeable lens cameras that we have, two very similar ones, pick one very simple and very good lens for each, set the camera up for mindful shooting, and then go to town, or to the woods, or anywhere else. We'd have to be tactical and selective during Leigh's back surgery recovery, but I am pleased to say that she was up for the challenge. We worked together to make the selections and settings that would suit each of us best. Here's the rundown. For Leigh's part, we worked together to choose the Panasonic S5, the first one, the Mark I. This is a great mirrorless camera and can take advantage of all of the lenses from the L-mount Alliance, Sigma, Panasonic, and Leica. With lenses from each brand to choose from, we picked a completely different one using an inexpensive M to L-mount adapter. Leigh opted for our Voigtlander Ultron 28mm f2 lens. This is a perfect, fairly wide-angle lens to shoot whatever comes your way. The quality's stellar, even wide open at f2, and while it's not a Leica M-mount lens, it also trades at a substantial discount to any Leica M lenses. So for some therapy shooting, it fits the bill absolutely perfectly. Now, a couple of notes on M-mount lenses. If you're not familiar, these are manual focus lenses, and the focusing distance is not stellar. You have to be a certain distance away from your subject. The M-mount dates back much earlier than today's mirrorless marvels with high-tech construction and electronics. M-mount is the epitome of old school. And one fabulous thing about most mirrorless cameras is that you can set the focal length of your chosen lens in the camera, and most will give you focus confirmation one way or another. As you can see, our Panasonic does with the red highlights here. You won't be as fast as autofocus, but that's the spirit of what we're doing here, is to slow down and just do things the way that we want. Of the two fixed lens cameras we both mentioned earlier, the X100 series and the Leica Q series, Leigh's setup most closely resembles the Leica Q series. She'll have f2 with the Voigtlander and manual focus, while the Q series has a 28mm but f1.7 lens, and the Q series does have autofocus. Now for me, I like the idea of manual focus, but I can also get very frustrated with it. So for my choice, I opted for an autofocus lens. The focal length I chose is no accident, 35mm on this full frame S5 Mark II. It is a very similar camera to the S5, but it does have a few key differences and upgrades. One, real-time Luts, which will come into play in this exercise in just a few moments. This is the Sigma 35mm f2 Contemporary DGDN I-series lens. This lens is truly representative of the full power of the L-mount Alliance, as this lens is superb on any of the L-mount cameras from the three participating brands. It's compact, lightweight, and for me, the 35mm focal length combined with wide open shooting at f2, it's magical. Perhaps that's also why our X100V has a 35mm equivalent field of view and also opens to f2. These parameters allow you to capture much of what comes your way, and f2 allows for low light shooting while also keeping the overall size and weight of the lens very compact. I will have the advantage of autofocus and a closer focusing distance compared to Leigh's setup. She'll have a wider focal length, a smaller lens overall, even with the adapter, And the manual focus experience that she often craves will be hers with her setup. Now, with the gear choices locked in for this project and a handshake agreement that we wouldn't make any changes to the hardware setup, it's time to talk about image settings. We both agreed that for simplicity, we would shoot JPEG, customize photo style settings in the camera, and then lock them in. For Nikon, these photo styles would be called picture controls. We're basically talking about settings on each brand, like vivid, landscape, monochrome, standard, flat, natural, etc. Like I said, this can differ. The terminology can differ between the top brands, but by and large, you can dial in something similar to these settings with virtually any mirrorless camera and then adjust specific parameters. Now, one important thing, anytime it would feel like therapy to adjust these image control settings, photo styles on the fly, we are giving ourselves permission to do that if it's just part of our flow. We did want to start with some preferences, and our intention is to stick with those, but also be adaptable and flexible. For Leigh, she decided on a high contrast black and white look, so she'll take us through how she set that up with the S5.
I'm in my own photo style. You can see that I named it Leigh HCBW at the top for high contrast black and white because that is what I did here. First of all, I needed the monochrome picture control to get us started. You can see that you can choose any of them here, but of course I want monochrome. And then I left contrast as it is because I wanted to customize my own high contrast look. To do that, I brought the highlights up and then I took the shadows down. I took the shadows down more than I brought the highlights up so that I was able to maintain some of the detail in the highlights, but I was comfortable losing some of the detail in the shadows. I didn't do anything with color tone, but I did add the yellow filter. You can see that you can use red, orange, yellow. I chose yellow. And then I did also want some grain to give it a filmy kind of a look, and I used standard. You also have low and high, or you can turn it off, of course. And then I took sharpness down by 1. The reason I did that was to give it a filmier look. And then on top of that, I did reduce noise reduction. And that is all I did, and this is the look that I came up with.
Over to my setup, with the flexibility of the S5 II and real-time Luts, I decided to push things a little bit further. Being a very competent cinema camera, the S5 II has Luts, color lookup tables, loaded into the camera, as does the S5. But the S5 II has one more trick. You can load your own custom Luts onto the camera itself from various sources, including your own creations from tools that can create Luts like Adobe Photoshop. And while Luts are often associated with video, the S5 II allows you to use custom Luts for still images also. In practical terms, this means that you can have the camera work with an alternate set of color tone, hue, saturation, contrast, and brightness, where the camera, while processing the image, looks up its colors in your lookup table and then uses your adjusted colors in place of the ones that the S5 II would normally use when rendering the scene. Now, that was a mouthful, but from a practical standpoint, you can edit an image in Photoshop, just one image, and then have the S5 II effectively shoot with that same edit burned into the images that you haven't taken yet, that you're taking right now. It will apply those. Think of it as this. Think of it as applying a Lightroom filter, but while you're capturing the image at that moment, and you've pre-selected which filter you want applied during that image capture. Now, one thing that I've really become interested in, as many people have, is low fidelity or LoFi photography. With all of our cameras, I've come up with settings that take much of the rendering technology in the camera and simplify it or even degrade it. For example, in Leigh's black and white recipe for the S5, she added grain, which often is an undesirable characteristic to have if you're talking about a technical camera review. I decided that my lo-fi look for this project would be the increasingly popular early 2000s Digicam look. The colors would be muted, perhaps a bit washed out, and some more cyan and magenta than we are accustomed to today. I had a Nikon Coolpix which did this perfectly. I mean, it was a terrible camera overall, by almost any standard. But there's nothing wrong with a little nostalgia, even for the bad stuff. So what this means is that I took this perfectly good photo from the S5 II into Photoshop, and I made adjustments like you're seeing me do here. And after some fiddling, I had the 2 decades ago Digicam adjustments that I wanted or even craved. Perhaps I exaggerated them a little bit, but this project is my opportunity to make the rules, so I went with it. Then, using Photoshop's native capability for this, I made a cube file, which is the color remapping. It's the LUT itself. I loaded this onto the root of the S5 II's SD card, I put it in the camera, and I used the S5 II's menus to load this LUT into the camera. Then, I'm back in the same menus on the S5 II that Leigh used on the S5, except the S5 II gives me the option to use this LUT of my creation to augment my chosen photo style. Now there's another way to do this where you just use the LUT without the addition of a photo style, but my method here gives you more flexibility to adjust settings in the camera applied on top of the LUT. And that felt like it might be my jam out in the field for this project. With everything baked in and applied, camera firmly set to JPEG, it was time for some test images, and it was super cool to see the adjustments that I made to one single image in Photoshop being applied to all of my new captures with the camera, all in real time, as I was clicking the shutter button and it was writing the images to the card with this LUT and the modifications that I made all baked into the image. With everything set up how we liked it, it was time to get out in the field and put the hardware and our camera software settings to the test. Now maybe it came across or maybe it didn't, but I can truly say that we both had a blast going with simple setups, weird colors for me, no colors for Leigh, and it really is proof that although there's definitely some magic with fixed lens cameras, if you have something like a Panasonic S5, Nikon Z-series camera, Sony, Canon, one of the others, the list goes on and on. With some clever lens choices and camera settings, you too can create a setup that keeps the pressure low and the creativity high. Now, if you've done something like this, let us know the details down in the comments. And like always, thank you for watching.